chaos to order. From chaos to order. Here we go. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. FC2O.
Hello, welcome back to FC2O. It's been what some might call a little hiatus of about 4 years since our last episode was put out. So thank you to all of those you who've continued to listen to some of those previous episodes. This is a little preview to explain, why we took FC2 off air, why we stopped producing it, what's happened in the interim, and why now is a good time to look at re-releasing it. So hopefully you will be able to join us, and not just in the next few weeks, but across the coming years. So it just remains for me to say, enjoy the show. Here we go. Hello and welcome back to FC2O. Now, it's been about 4 years since we were last online, and so there's been a bit of a break there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to relaunch, and this is just a little bit of a preview, just to let people know that we're relaunching, and to give you a bit of insight into why we stopped previously, but also what we are now doing to make it a bit different and to hopefully make it more interesting for everyone. Of course, one of the features is that we actually have video now, whereas previously around 2019 podcasts were primarily audio. Now you can't really have a podcast without having the video, and so hence if you're watching this on the video on the Matt Wallden Health and Performance YouTube page, then great, or on Facebook or Insta or whatever. But if you're just listening to it on the podcast, fine as well. Now, there are some images, of course, associated with this, seeing as it is a video. And so what we'll do is we will post those in the show notes at mattwalden.com under the podcast tab. So if you want to look at some of these images or follow them as we go through, then of course you're welcome to do that. But yeah, so this is FC2O, and we are, as I say, we're relaunching, and you may recall the previous logo. So the previous logo had a little picture of me on one side and the sun on the other. And, it was by design. The orbits that you can see in that logo, they are examples of attractor states. So essentially where a planet is in a stable state with the sun, or it could be a moon in a stable state with a planet. These are examples of attractor states in nature. And they are part of what is termed chaos theory. And so you may recall FC2O stands for From Chaos to Order. And, it's inspired by a bunch of different things. It's inspired by the fact that I've been writing a bit about the importance of chaos theory and also complexity theory in some of the papers I've been writing for the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies. Also the fact that Jordan Peterson had been talking a bit about chaos and order, and that seemed topical at the time. When I stopped during COVID, I was a little concerned that I didn't really want to bring out FC2O again when there's all this talk of the New World Order, going from chaos to the New World Order. And so I was a little bit like, oh, God, I don't know whether I want to actually have that name anymore. But hopefully move beyond that a little bit now. But yeah, so, the idea really is that in this day and age, there's so much information. And as COVID illustrated, so much disparate information. So information from credible sources, or in theory, credible sources, you always have to follow the money, of course, and it can say completely different things, completely disparate information. And so you can have, one virologist saying one thing and an equally qualified virologist saying exactly the opposite. And so we have to make sense of that chaos, try and make order of that chaos. And so FC2O really, pre-COVID was an attempt to do that in that pre-COVID world. And so, just to give a quick recap, what we had was, I think we had 26 episodes, one preview to those episodes, 27 in total. And you can see a little list of them. Actually, I'll show you a list of them here. So now if you want to look at the list, because you're just listening, then again, you go to mattwalden.com to the podcast tab, and you can see the list of them. And if you want to listen to them or look at the show notes, they should all be there. But some of the sort of highlight guests for me were, of course, Paul Check. And we did a couple of podcasts with him. And here we've got a picture of him throwing an extremely heavy weight above his head. We've got Phil Beach just above the FC2O there. And he was a huge inspiration to me. They're probably the two most inspirational people on my career. And I interviewed both of those. And now Phil was the person who actually told me, first of all, about the notion of attractor states. And the context in which he told me. Now, the first thing he described was the notion that when the moon formed, because of course that was from an asteroid strike, and you get complete chaos. You get, all kinds of breakup of the meteor in the atmosphere, and it's going around. And of course, there's nuclear winter and all this kind of stuff. And gradually, bit by bit, all of those meteors or meteor fragments gradually reformed back into a moon. And that moon initially was very close to the Earth's surface, and so it's literally pulling up the crust of the Earth, and it's extremely chaotic, but it gradually became more orderly, and now it sits, I forget how many miles away from the Earth, but it's pretty constant, and it revolves around the Earth at a pretty constant speed, 29 point something days, which is exactly the duration of the average female menstrual cycle, of course. Anyway, so that's an example of the moon going into an attractor state with the Earth. So it's now in a stable state. So what Phil suggested was that there are certain attractor states or attractors in the human body. And you could look at that. So really, attractors and chaos theory are from the field of physics. Whereas in biology, you tend to talk about complexity theory. And it's a very similar field. There's lots of overlaps. And in fact, it reminds me, there's a guy called Dobzhansky, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but a famous biologist who said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Okay, and I think that's a really powerful quote. But I think he was, let's say, being conservative with that comment, because really nothing in science makes sense except in the light of evolution. So, evolution, I think, is a hugely powerful tool for us to guide our thinking. And in fact, we've got several podcasts already recorded with people that specialize in evolution. This was another thing that attracted me to both Phil's work and to Paul's work. And you can see on this slide Mark Sisson there, who, of course, he's the guy that stand-up paddleboard with the six-pack. He was one of my first guests because we've written a paper together. And a couple of papers, actually, and talking about Phil Beach's archetypal rest postures. Now, the archetypal rest postures, again, you can hear about these on the podcast I did with Phil. But the idea there is that Phil kind of conceptualized this notion of archetypal rest postures as being there's only a certain number of postures that we can adopt when you're using the floor to rest, which, of course, for most of evolutionary time and across most species, that's how most animals rest and how most humans rest. And in fact, the chair is only actually about 4,000 years old. It's a Mesopotamian invention, just like the wheel was. So there's pros and cons to the Mesopotamian. I can't even say the word Mesopotamians. Of course, undoubtedly we would have sat on logs and we would have sat on rocks and so on, but primarily we would have used the floor. And cross-culturally, of course, what happens and what Phil observed is that if you look cross-culturally, then there's only a certain number of postures that human beings can easily adopt or tend to regularly adopt, and that these could be seen as what he would call attractor states. He calls them archetypal rest postures. So they're archetypical of human beings and often of primates as well. So deep squat would be one. Sitting cross-legged is another. Sitting long-legged and sitting kneeling. These are all examples of archetypal rest postures. And you can combine them as well and so on. But anyway, Phil's notion is that those archetypal rest postures are really forms of attractor states. So he was the first person to introduce me to this notion of attractors in biology. And I think that's a really potent concept. So there's Phil. And actually, I was sharing Phil's ideas with Mark Sisson. And that's what we wrote our papers about. And Mark did a lovely little video, which you'll be able to find. If you root around on my website, you'll be able to find the video that Mark did talking about our papers and talking about these archetypal rest postures. Then you've got Diane Lee, who is one of the world's great physiotherapists. And if you're looking at the image, you'll see her in the middle of the diagram there, or the middle of the picture behind the word podcasts. And again, Diane, the first book of hers that I read, the Pelvic Girdle, I think the first chapter is all about evolutionary anatomy. And so, really most people that, from my perspective, have their shit together and have a really optimal perspective and are able to contextualize what is going on in human function, they use an evolutionary model to understand human function. And then, so in the bottom left-hand corner of the diagram, you've got Leah Keith, who wrote the book The Vegetarian Myth. And again, she uses evolutionary principles very much tied in with Weston A. Price's work. And of course, that leads into talking about Bill Walcott, who also was a guest on the original series of shows, and his metabolic typing approach. Paul also talks about Weston A. Price. So Paul, Bill Walcott, Leah Keith, they all talk about Weston A. Price. I'm pretty sure Mark System will have done as well. So, there's all these overlaps because this is deep wisdom that helps us to make sense or to make order out of the chaos. So anyway, I think evolution really helps us to cut a path through that chaos. And that's why there's a leaning towards these specialists in that area. So anyway, you can have a little look at the list, as I say, on the website. And if you want to revisit some of those old podcasts, then of course they're still fascinating to listen to. And I can see that actually many of you have still been listening to them over the months since we last published one. So the next image that I have here is a typical bell-shaped curve, just a normal population distribution. And so, most of you will be familiar with that as a graph, a bell-shaped curve. And in this case, it's looking at heights, and it's got nothing to do with the podcast, apart from the fact it's a good illustration of a bell-shaped curve, which shows the 5th percentile, so the first 5% of the population, then the middle 90%, and then the 95th to 100th percentile, if you like, so the last 5%. And the reason I've got it up here is that, going into 2020, as we've discussed, I closed the podcasts, largely driven by COVID, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But what I hadn't realized was that actually FC2O was doing really well. It was I was getting around 600 to 1,200 listeners, which, if you look at that from the perspective of getting people along to the village hall each week, that's a pretty good number. So someone pointed that out to me, because I was kind of saying, it's not really been that successful, and they made that comment, and you think, oh yeah, well, I suppose that is quite good then. But in terms of podcast world, particularly when you're comparing yourself to the likes of Paul Check and Mark Sisson and others that have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of listeners, then it feels like you're not doing so well. But also at that point in time, so this is 2019, it's a bit like the Wild West. I remember Gavin Jennings, the head of the Czech Institute, the CEO of Czech Institute, kind of said to me, podcasts are just like the Wild West at the moment, because it's a completely new industry. No one really knows how to play it. But at that point in time, you really needed about 5,000 to 10,000 listeners to attract sponsorship. And I'd never really started the podcast in order to make money from it. I'd done it really for fun, and because I think it was kind of 6 months after Paul had released his podcast, and a bunch of people said, "Oh, Matt, you should do one." And I thought, yeah, that'd be fun. And I looked into it, and it wasn't too expensive to put it on. And I thought, okay, yeah, I'll give it a go. And so I did, and it was fun as anticipated. But it takes a lot of time. And what I hadn't quite realized was that each podcast episode takes, I would say, at least a day of time. So you get sort of 6 months down the line, I've done 26 episodes, and you realize that's 26 days in 6 months. And if you think what the average person works in a month, it's about 20 days, maybe 21, 22. So I've done 26 days. So more than a month's worth of work in 6 months on the podcast, and not been paid a bean for it. And you start to realize, I am getting a bit stressed, and I am finding it hard to keep up with my patients, and I am finding it hard to find time for the family. And this is getting, a bit too much. So, I kind of felt like I was in a little bit of a jam, because, wasn't big enough to attract sponsors. And so it's kind of, well, how can I turn this into a business venture? So I kind of sat back and let COVID take over as it did. But the reason I got the bell-shaped curve up on the screen is that what I hadn't realized is with those kinds of figures at that point in time, at least, that put my podcast in the top 5% of podcasts globally. So although it wasn't near the numbers that the Czechs and the Sissons of the world were getting, it actually was doing quite well. But anyway, so knowing that, of course, that's somewhat inspirational. But what I really found was that I'd gone, started up, trying to make order from the chaos. So take people from chaos to order, but I was going back to chaos again because of the podcast. So that was one reason why we stopped. Now, another thing that happened around that time was that I went out to Australia and New Zealand to put on some seminars, and again, actually one of them with Phil Beach, which was fantastic, but really presenting a lot of my own ideas and concepts, built from really understanding how to develop models, which is largely inspired by Paul Chek's work, by Phil Beach's work, and Serge Grakovetsky, someone else largely inspired through evolutionary approaches to understanding spinal mechanics. Anyway, I was out there presenting these conferences, or I should say workshops, and it was a lot of work, of course, a lot of work to get out there, a lot of work to fill up the workshops, and to make them financially viable, and a lot of work to prepare and deliver the workshops and all the rest of it. And I called it 2020 Vision because it seemed like a good name at the time. But what I realized is that I didn't have 2020 vision at all, because I didn't foresee the pandemic coming. And so I was out there actually in March 2020. They say, well, hindsight is 2020, don't they? And that's true. But foresight, not so much. And so, I'm there delivering, my first set of seminars in New Zealand, and second set of seminars in Sydney. And I'm really looking forward to getting 2 or 3 days at the end. I had a couple of 2 or 3 days spare where I could just get to the beach, chill out, and think, kind of celebrate the fact that we'd had a successful time. And then my wife's kind of on the phone and saying, well, Matt, they're looking at closing the airports. I think you need to get back. You might need to book an early flight. So ultimately, I did have to book an early flight. So I literally flew out the day after I finished teaching. Didn't get to rest at all, but at least I got home. And that was an interesting flight back, because I was flying via Hong Kong. So you can imagine going into China on the way home when the COVID is raging, and so all kinds of things going on, all kinds of fascinating costumes that people were wearing on the planes, from kind of almost like deep sea diving suits to Second World War gas masks to surgical masks. So someone in full surgical regalia on the plane. There's a family of 4 who were wearing just standard face masks, but all wearing yellow Macs with their hoods up, as if it was going to rain COVID onto them. so anyway, I got back home safe and sound, and no issues there. But yeah, so that was the podcast really helped to drive that set of seminars, I should say, out in Australia and New Zealand. And when I got back, I recorded a few more of the podcasts, but I really felt I had other things I had to focus on. So although I was keen to start up a kind of FC2O 2.0, I really felt that at that point in time, I had to dive into what was going on with COVID. And, the first few weeks, I'm kind of looking at the various figures from the Office of National Statistics. I'm looking at various data from medical journals, and I'm thinking, this is really interesting, because this is not, what we're hearing on the news is completely different to what the actual figures are. So I had some eyebrows raised immediately. Obviously, when you don't know much about it, there's more fear naturally. But as you learn more, I think it was around May time 2020, there was a paper that came out in the BMJ which said that 80% of people that get COVID won't even know they've got COVID. They will be asymptomatic. So now you're thinking, well, wait a minute, this doesn't look like what we were seeing on the news 2 months ago with people falling over on the streets in China. That didn't seem to happen anywhere else in the world, just purely those early pictures, which are highly questionable now, of course. But anyway, for the longest time, I wanted to reopen the podcast with a podcast called Contextualizing COVID. And I was going to try and put some of that data into context. But of course, as the pandemic unfolded and as the papers got published and the opinion pieces came out and you got various virologists and statisticians and so on both sides of the camp, but especially on the side that were questioning the narrative, the amount of data just went exponential. And so it became a project that was just too difficult for me to pin down. Now, that said, I've come up with a way to present contextualizing COVID. And so my plan is to still actually put out a podcast in the coming weeks, which is contextualizing COVID and helping to understand how different people had completely different perspectives on it. And hopefully that will be helpful. I know I got a lot of nice comments from people through social media, especially over that period of the pandemic when we were in lockdown and so on, because I think people did need a second perspective. So anyway, one of the things that I was providing was actually a focus on health as opposed to a focus on disease, and that's really what we specialize in through the check system, is focusing on promoting health and supporting health. And so a lot of my I put out a bunch of videos early in the pandemic, and it was explained to people, things like vitamin D and sunlight and exercise and fresh air and breathing through the nose and various things that actually would support health and support function when it looked like there could be food shortages and there might be supply issues. I was explaining the benefits of fasting and how that can support immune function and so on and so forth. So that was really, my goal in those early stages, those early days of COVID and the early days of the lockdown, was to support people and provide some reassurance. And actually, as it turns out, one of the biggest killers was anxiety. It turns out that anxiety predicted death more so than any other factor apart from obesity, if I recall. So, the techniques that were used by our governments to instill fear actually killed more people than anything else, contributing, or let's say comorbidities that were contributing to the COVID scenario or the COVID picture. So anyway, lots to be considered and reviewed there. So that's something we'll come around to. But one of the other issues that I had was that it was very difficult for me to do the podcast, of course, when the kids were at home, because of course now everyone's off school, off work. And so difficult to do the podcast from home. It was kind of challenging anyway, because I was working from home, got a road outside. So every time a car went by, it would mess with the recording. We've got a dog, so if he barked, that would be a problem. Obviously the kids, so there are all these kind of little factors. And I was thinking, okay, well, I'll relaunch because we were planning to move house. So I thought I'll relaunch when we're in the new house. So actually in November 2020, we moved to a new house, and I'll just show you, if you're looking at the video, you can see a picture of the garden here. And the idea was, which indeed we did, was to build an office in the garden, so I could be away from the family, away from that hubbub of family life. So here in the image, you can see the garden, and you can see up towards the back of the image, there is our Mini, which is on the road there. So there's a main road. And of course, it's quite exposed, but we're going to build a cabin to hopefully, soundproofed enough that we can still do the podcast from it. So anyway, here you see from a slightly different angle, put a fence in. So that's to help block out some of the road noise. And it turned out it was absolutely useless for blocking out road noise. So that didn't really help much at all. Then you see the structure going up. So there's the foundations. You see the walls going up. You see the inner skin, if you like, the insulation, all absolutely useless for blocking out road noise, didn't help at all. Then the outer cladding went on, still didn't make any difference to the road noise, really. Windows went in, doors went in, not much difference to the road noise. You think, well, maybe I'll record it at nighttime, but at nighttime you get almost no road noise, and then you get someone going right past, or a truck going sort of essentially shaking the whole foundations of the clinic. So that didn't help either. And then finally we put some gates in, thinking, well, maybe that will help, and that didn't help either. So really, it turns out a lot of road noise comes through the ground, not through the air. And so anyway, come 2023, I'm out in the US. I'm teaching some courses for the Czech Institute, and Phil Dallaire, who is the Institute's videographer, he's there doing a bit of filming, and he says to me, "Here, Matt, have a listen to this." And he's got some recording of me doing some presenting, and he says, "This is the original, so you're listening to it, and there's a little bit of background noise, a little bit whirring, maybe a car going by or a plane going overhead, something like that." And he says, "And now listen to this one," and it was completely clean, and I was like, "Wow, that's cool." And it was, it was clearer, crisper. And I said, "So, what's that then?" And he said, "That's AI." And I'm like, "Oh, right." And he said, "Yeah, it's a new thing by Adobe. It's anyway, I forget what it's called, Adobe Podcast or something like that." And anyway, so so I thought, well, that's interesting, because that could be something that I could use to relaunch FC2O. So, another element to this, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that time is so much at a premium these days, but also it's so much time to launch a podcast and to run the podcasts. But then it turns out there's also AI that helps you to edit the podcast these days. So that is going to help as well. So I thought, okay, well, I could relaunch FC2O with some AI help. So that was something. What I want to do is take the opportunity to introduce you to FC2O AI. Okay, so there we are. That's what we're going to call it. So FC2O AI. Now, of course, in terms of how it will appear online, it will still just say FC2O. But we're going to be using AI to support it. But it's not just called AI from the perspective that we all know from artificial intelligence, but also because I'm going to bring these in here. Now, those of you watching will be able to see what I'm doing, but we've got one mic there and one mic here, and the mic I'm speaking into here. And so we have two other guests, and that is Archie and Isabella. So that is why it's FC2O AI. Because Archie's my son at 16 years of age. He's just done his GCSE, so that's his his kind of qualifications before they go on to A levels and specialize here in the UK. And Isabella's just done her A levels, so she's specialized in sociology, psychology, and English. Archie's got a kind of particular interest in sports and in business. So when we're interviewing people, we're going to take a little bit of a business angle to try and understand, what it is that they do and how they make their living, and how that then converts into the services or the products that they are providing. And like I say, Isabella is very into her health and sort of looking after herself, but also the psychology and the sociology side of it. So part of the goal here is to make it slightly transgenerational, so that they can put their younger perspective on it. Also, so they can keep an eye on what's trending. So that's another thing. So one of the things that actually inspired this idea is that Archie and I were on our way into school. I'm taking him into school to drop him in. And he said, "Dad, did you know that aspartame, or aspartame as you Americans call it, causes infertility?" And I said, "Well, I don't, I've not heard that before. I know it's a neurotoxin or an excitotoxin, but I don't know about having a fertility issue." He said, "Well, I just saw it on TikTok." And I thought, okay, all right, I better explain this to him. So anyway, we had this long conversation. I won't go into it too much because we're actually going to do a podcast on this. But essentially, I explained to him how to look into it and how to think about it and how we can explore the veracity of that and so on. And so that's something that we're going to talk about, where there's something that's trending on TikTok or whatever it might be. We'll draw that out and we'll have a chat about it, and we'll talk about the research and what I understand of it from a clinical perspective. And we're probably going to get some of their mates on as well. So we've got that kind of transgenerational thing. But part of the function of having them involved is it's a fresh idea, right? It's something that I don't think there's too many parent-child podcasts out there. But also it allows them to rein me or my guests in if we start getting too technical. So, for example, one guest we're going to have on is a guy called Nijs. And you or I, if you're an English-speaking person, or let's say English native, you probably read his name as Joe Nijs, but it's pronounced Nijs. He's Belgian, and he's perhaps the world's leading neuroscientist in terms of pain neuroscience. So certainly one of them. He's very prolific in his publications, really highly thought of, and that's why I wanted to write a couple of papers with him. So I did that in 2021, and we're going to have him on the show, but of course he's very, very technical, and I've done my best to get up to speed with that technical information. So we might be talking about BDNF or something, or some kind of long-term potentiation of neurons, and that's all kind of fairly normal language, particularly to Joe or Yo, and somewhat to me as well. But the idea of having the kids there is for them to say, wait a second, Dad, what is this BDNF you're talking about? And I can say, right, okay, well, that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So what it does is, X, Y, Z. And so hopefully what it does, it makes the podcast more accessible. It means that, those stupid questions that people might have, or the things that might throw people off as they're listening, actually get reined in, get sort of weeded out by the kids. And they are welcome to take the mickey out of me if I'm getting too on my high horse about anything, or if I get too provocative, whatever it might be. So that's the idea of having them on board. So now, if you've seen any of my writing, if you've seen any of my webinars, then you will probably have seen this diagram. And for those of you who are just listening, it's again another bell-shaped curve. But it's just a nice one to look at, because what it's illustrating is that there's always a kind of level of simplicity that occurs when we first learn something, or we first approach a new concept or a new idea. So, for example, you're interviewing a guest like the one I was just saying, talking about pain neuroscience. That might be a new topic for you. So you'd be like a beginner. And so the complexity of what you understand would be quite low. And the elegance with which you understand pain neuroscience is going to be quite low as well. So complexity is going up high on the y-axis, it's going vertical, and elegance is going horizontal on the x-axis. And so as you go across from left to right on the bell-shaped curve, what you see is that initially it's low complexity, low elegance. And as you move into higher and higher complexity, then you get more and more elegant in the way you understand things, the way you explain things. And then, of course, when you ultimately get to a point where you're an expert, the next step is really to become a master of that field and to be able to explain those things with increasing simplicity. And that's why Oliver Wendell Holmes said, for simplicity on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give a fig. But for simplicity on the other side of complexity, I would give everything I own. And that's what he's talking about. And this is what Einstein was talking about when he said, if you can't teach it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it well enough. Okay, so this is the simplicity. Also, Da Vinci said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And so that's what we're aiming for, is this order or simplicity that arises from chaos or complexity. And that's what FC2O is all about. So what's new? Well, just as a recap, what's new is the AI format. Okay, so we're going to be using AI, partly for the sound, partly for the video and the show notes and so on. So fingers crossed that will work. And also for promoting it. See, this was one of the things before, was that I was so busy trying to put the shows out that often I just squeeze them in at the very last minute, put them out, but I wouldn't even have time to tell people that I put them out. So I wouldn't post it on Facebook or on Twitter or anything. It was just literally, I put it out and just hope people would listen. So that was an issue of the previous format. But with the AI, we can actually get that to auto post. So that would be good. Of course, because we're using AI and because we're now 5 years down the line from when I first started, at least, we're going to be using video, as you can see here. And that will be on our YouTube channel, on the Matt Wallden Health and Performance channel. We're also obviously aiming to expand the audience, not just to grow it because we want to grow it, and that might help us to attract sponsors as well, but also because we're expanding the age range and we're trying to get trying to be helpful to the younger generation, which I think in turn will actually be more helpful to, let's say, the middle generation and the older generation, because it's going to make everything that bit more clear. So we've also got some footage or I should say audio in the archives from people that we actually had interviews with before COVID, or sometimes with 2 or 3 of them, it was during COVID, again, in this anticipation that I was going to start up FC2O again. and they've just kind of sat there. But they're good interviews. So what we'll do is we'll put those out. Now, of course, we don't have video with those, but what we'll do is we'll either at least have a picture of whoever's talking, or hopefully we might even be able to get a little bit of video or some relevant imagery. So that's something that we will put out when we do the archive versions. We are, of course, looking for product sponsors and brand partners. But what we're going to do on that front, one of the things also that I've had to take a little bit of time to get aligned is to essentially arrange for us to be able to sell some of our own products. Okay, and so I've got, for years I've had these neutralizer devices, for example, which are biofeedback tools that help you to get optimal posture when you're exercising. If indeed you want to keep a neutral spine in a specific exercise. So that's something that I've had on the site for a long time, but I haven't really had it optimized. And so now, if we're talking about something relevant, like one of these guys that's in the archives, Christopher Norris, he's one of the more prolific and well thought of physiotherapists. He's written several textbooks, lots of papers, presented at loads of conferences, and he's a lovely guy. Did a great interview with him, sat in the archives, but he's someone who talks a lot about neutral spine. Diane Lee is someone who talks a lot about neutral spine, and maybe we'll get her back on at some point. Paul Check, of course, is someone who taught me about neutral spine. So these are all people that understand the importance, but also the relevance and the context when neutral spine is helpful. And of course, if they are talking about that, well, that's where we might break and go, okay, so we've been talking about neutral spine, how it can be helpful to rehabilitate in certain circumstances. And here's a tool that helps you to do that. So we will just break and say, we might, say if you get this now, then you get some kind of offer or whatever. But it's really just to sort of let people know we've got products. So we've got tangible products like the neutralizer. We've also got, you could say, intangible or digital products, which are things like webinars, ebooks, and we're going to be bringing out a bunch of other informational products as well that we will, again, just mention when relevant, so that if people want to support the podcast by going ahead and getting hold of those and support themselves in their health journey, then of course that's there as an option as well. So we're kind of acting as our own sponsors in some way, by hopefully getting a little trickle of income each episode, and then as the podcast grows, hopefully that also grows from a trickle to more of a flow of income. But as our numbers grow, we will be looking for brand partnerships as well. And we already have a couple in the pipeline where people are kind of saying, well, yeah, we'd be up for being involved in some way. So that's something that, again, it will be relevant. It will be, in the health and performance field. So, listen out for those as well. So that should mean that everything becomes viable and that we can provide these useful and engaging and, hopefully insightful podcasts to you on a regular basis. So I think that covers it all for now. So we've got FC2O AI from Chaos to Order with Archie and Isabella. Not necessarily every time, but they'll be involved quite a lot. And certainly the AI in terms of the artificial intelligence and the actual intelligence, hopefully, will be involved every time. So look forward to sharing some more of these times together with you, these episodes over the coming weeks, months, and years. Thanks. See you soon. Bye for now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that little outline of what's in store for you. The first episode is going to be with a colleague of mine, Alan Bigart from Denmark. He's a Scotsman from the Glasgow area of Scotland who now lives just outside of Copenhagen. And we're going to be discussing our path together. And in particular, we've worked closely in the Czech world, in the Five Fingers world, and now Alan has brought the first range of earthing shoes to the market. So these are shoes which are designed to allow you to earth, and they're very effective. I've got a pair, and he's shown me all the tools and gizmos to show how much they earth you compared to a normal pair of shoes, or compared to barefoot, and it's pretty much identical to being barefoot. So we'll be talking a bit about that, about the journey to getting there, and we actually will have some of these shoes available on our site for you to have a peruse as well. So we'll look forward to seeing you on the new show.